Oh boy, it was nuts. It's all a real balancing game. It's really obvious to say, but when you're in it and you're starting to spin those plates, or the characters, or the tone, or the plot.
That was Peter Sohn, a director at Pixar Animation Studios, and I've got the pleasure of meeting him at the Annecy Film Festival. So I invited him to the channel to discuss about Elemental, a great film that subverts the expectations of our romantic comedy, including a very unique take on the love triangle. So enjoy the interview, and I'm sure you're gonna learn a lot.
I've just never been punched in the face with beauty before.
The whole point of Write for Animation is to help people become better storytellers. And so feel free to geek out about storytelling, screenwriting.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was a crazy experience for sure. I think one of the craziest in my life. I grew up with romantic movies or romantic comedies or movies with romance in them. Before I jump into just that romance genre, this idea of Elemental started in several places. There were several seeds that really started this film, but the main one being this question of what if fire fell in love with water? And that was sort of a simple hook that brought in the idea of romance and brought in the idea of elements and brought in this sort of idea of fantasy and what could happen. And so that started triggering exploration into the romance genre and several other pieces as well. The interesting thing was, even though the question was romantic, there were other pieces that weren't romantic that connected to the film. There was an immigration storyline and a father and daughter storyline that started to appear immediately as we were trying to build stakes and build sort of conflict within the world. And as we were looking at romance, we were looking at other genres as well. And early on, it really became about how to intertwine several different concepts. And but before I really get into that, jumping back into that question of what if fire fell in love with water, between the Sound of Music and the history of romance movies, I have, seen a lot of them and have fallen in love with them. And, I grew up in New York. And so there was a lot of those movies that started to come up between, the 80s and 90s. There was like Moonstruck that was Norman Jewison's film of Cher and Nicolas Cage, and how, that and the Woody Allen movies of Manhattan and characters falling in love, but with a backdrop of a city, and that in itself had its own sort of genre within the romance of films world. True. And then internationally, but from Amelie to Shall We Dance in Japan, and there were these sort of pieces of these films that I started to really embrace. Now, one of the main tenets of those films, to break that down further, I worked on several films here at Pixar, and there was always this concept of like the road movie or the buddy picture, where you have two characters sort of getting to know each other, testing each other, and then through a cathartic sort of connection, they move forward and become friends. That world and how that sits next to a romance, it was very close. You're like, okay, yeah, you have two characters that are beginning to know each other, and they go through a very similar experience. The difference for me from the movies that I had loved in the romance genre were that these two characters in a romance movie have holes in their lives. Mm-hmm. They have missing pieces of themselves that those two characters will fill in each other, that overlay over the buddy picture easily. All of a sudden, you really needed to understand, what was the missing or broken piece of this character? And between Sound of Music and, it could happen one night, or any of the myriad of movies, you started understanding like, oh, right. The secret to Moonstruck is that Cher and Nicolas Cage are both broken. That's what's missing. It's not that they're missing pieces. They're missing pieces, but they have both been broken and harmed through life. One was literally maimed by losing his hand, and the other having lost her husband with bad luck in a plane, and all of a sudden the characters start to form these puzzle shapes to them that all of a sudden you begin to see like, oh, they fit. And when discovering that they could fit, there was a real excitement for the audience to go, oh, these two pieces, even though they're missing these two characters, those puzzle pieces slip right into each other and they fit. And there's a real excitement to that began sort of our foundation of understanding who Ember was and what Wade needed to be. And then the two other pieces are, in a romance genre, is the world pulling them apart, or are they pulling themselves apart? Those were sort of the two paths that I remember exploring, and we explored a lot of. We literally boarded versions of the film where they were pulling themselves apart, or the world was pulling themselves apart.
My understanding is that compared to, let's say, Finding Nemo, I always analyze that film thinking about, Marlin needs to find the truth, and Dory is the embodiment of that. And but the main arc happens in Marlin's life. Everybody arcs in a film, but specifically in romantic comedy, there is a complementary aspect where they both learn from each other, and the union. Yes. Is that how you see it in character construction as well?
Like, when we started thinking about Ember and Wade, all of a sudden the father came into picture, and then the love story became a triangle. And it really was, as I remember pitching this, that you think that this would be a story between a young woman falling in love with a young guy, but it's also a daughter falling in love with a father. And that triangle sort of shifted the sort of the arcing of all the characters in our explorations, and it all of a sudden shifted, like you would balance into a romance, but then you would shift into a family drama. And that was very difficult. That was really a hard balance. The whole time, you're also trying to fit it into a really large summertime movie. And what does that even mean? What does that even mean anymore? And this was a really interesting summer because, the movie started off so poorly, and then it started gaining legs and connecting and trying to understand, like when we first started building up the piece of this movie, I grew up with animation, loving them because of how universal it was, that it didn't need to be, I could jump into the shoes of an elephant. I could jump into the shoes of characters that weren't necessarily my race, and totally connect and root for these characters. And so that was a big piece of the beginning of this, romance or not. Like, it was just this world of fantasy characters that you're like, oh, can we even have an audience connect to these abstract beings? Before I could get to, could you feel these characters falling in love? I had issues with people going like, what are these characters? Right now they're very human, but when they started, they weren't as formed as they are.
Yeah, I've heard about the process that you went through. And also I imagine that it brought to you decisions of, suspension of disbelief. So I see this in Pixar films. When the emotion takes over, then the rules relax a little bit, but your mind is with the emotion, the action, you're completely engrossed. I wonder if that was something that you had in mind at the beginning.
Yeah, Pietro, that was probably one of the hardest things of the movie, honestly, trying to discover that balance. I feel like there are places that were successful and places that aren't as successful. And in my sort of language, I call it the left braining. All of a sudden you're in a moment, but then a detail or some shift in an idea will reel the left brain, and you just pull out of the emotion of it. And it's such a delicate balance because it's so subjective. What rules are for you and I in the real world, what movie rules are, it's a very ambiguous place where you want it to be believable. That's the whole magic. Like, it doesn't have to be realistic. But it has to be believable, because I'm talking about there were fantasy rules that we needed to build in the beginning. Like, talking about this young woman is seeing this water guy for the first time, but they're standing over a lake, and our whole audience is like, is the lake alive? Is that lake?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, oh boy, we can't even talk about these characters because there's so much rules to set up. If this was the live action movie with humans, I honestly say it would be easier because you would just accept so much, and everything's for free. With characters that are fantastical, nothing is for free, nothing. And so there were versions of the movie where we just start into these characters, and I had a screening where people were just like lost the whole time. And there was a version of that same story that we did, but then we did a setup where we had characters going through the city and then explaining the rules. Our whole opening of the film is just to set up rules, allow the audience to settle in, going like, oh, this is what happens. These elements can get hurt. They can interact and they don't interact. There is real water and there's people water, and so you're doing all this stuff in the beginning. And I remember that lesson of like, all of a sudden we did a little bit of explanation, and the same story that we had shown before without that explanation, everyone started understanding because now you had that pad of exposition. There was a lot of that was happening throughout this entire movie. And the fact, Pietro, that you enjoyed it to the level that you're saying is really, it overwhelms me because like, holy cow, the rules found a balance for you. And there's some people where the rules don't, like, how can they touch? How can, how is that even possible? That's not real science. Or she's holding that paper that should go up in flames. Like, there's so many details that can throw you out.
Yeah, and you're watching a movie. I mean,
yeah, I know.
You did, I think, a wonderful job because it means that the emotion are so real that it doesn't matter. You're into that world, and then there's an acceptance that is this pact with the audience that I think it worked really, really well. And going back to the structure of a romantic comedy, it's really like the father and daughter story, how it interlaces, especially in the ending and the climax. I think it's really, really beautiful. It elevates the genre.
To talk about the bow and the father-daughter relationship, there were North Stars to that. And what I mean by North Stars there were things that were seeds that began the development of this project that were emotional North Stars for me that I was always reaching for throughout the whole, this took a long time. And so you can get lost. And there was always this little North Star that would bring you back. And having a North Star when you in animation is, for me, really important because the process takes so long. And what objectivity is a real game that you play for yourself, because like you look at the material over and over and over again and it loses meaning at some point. And so having some thing that you emotionally can always come back to as the reason why you're doing this was very useful for me through this. And that was connected to the father-daughter storyline. It all connected to, in my real personal life, my father and mother had worked very hard for me and my brother to give us a life. And I had a moment where I got to thank them as an adult. And it was very emotional for me, and trying to understand my parents as people and what they had sacrificed became a North Star. And, through the making of this movie, both my parents passed away. My father died in the beginning in development, my mom later. And so all of a sudden that North Star got brighter and sharper, good or bad, that's what had happened. And there was a sentence that sort of hooked into that North Star. Usually for me, because I draw all the time, there's usually a visual that's connected to emotion. Mm-hmm. This was not. This was a line. As in writing something, that the North Star for this was, the shop was never the dream, you were the dream. And that, every time I thought about that line, I would get emotional and I would think about my parents. And so what did that mean? So taking that, a line, if it's in the film or not, I had no idea. It was just something that I had put on a little index card and put up there as this little like guide. Now, there were many forms of that relationship in the film. There was a version where Bernie ran a garbage incineration company, and Ember was gonna take over that, and it was more like a Godfather story, if you could believe it. Like, it was all of a sudden it was like a daughter that who found Wade very quickly. They fell in love very quickly in Act One, and then it was about the father trying to separate them, and he was very villainous. He was. So this was after I had lost my father. For some reason, I had all this like crazy darkness going into the film, but that storyline, as the father and daughter were warring and blowing up buildings, it never led to that North Star. So then all of a sudden, like the father became more of stakes, emotional stakes to the movie. He didn't become the antagonist. He is antagonistic toward Wade, but when I got lost there and I went back to that line of like, what if the shop was never the dream? It would become this little emotional equation for him. Oh, Ember was misunderstood something that she believed her whole life of what her father was doing, for his own dreams. And that started to build, oh, where did those dreams come from? That comes from his own past. And what specificity could I connect that to? And that I started looking into my family lives and other immigrants' lives, other first-gen, second-generation people at Pixar. They would all talk about going to a new country and not wanting to lose their identity, or that families didn't want to lose their identity. And so that became that second part of the DNA connected to the shop was never the dream. And then so thus that idea of the flashback was born, where we would see Bernie not getting approval from his own father in his homeland. And that was the equation. That was the emotional equation of like, oh, he broken because he feels like he didn't get approval because his own father thought he would lose a sense of his identity, of his culture and of his fireness and all that. And so he's been building a life to prove that he is fiery. He upholds those traditions. And not only that, his daughter will as well. And then, Ember discovers more about that in that equation of 1 + 1 = 2. The equation being, we understand what he left behind, what he sacrificed, and then plus the not having the approval from his own father equals Ember understanding it and then giving her father the bow. And so that was the emotional equation that we were reaching for, connected to the shop was never the dream.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I think that very, very emotional. I also left my country, so it hit home really hard. And,
Pietro.
But
When did you leave your country?
In my 20s, I left Italy, and first I was in LA. I studied there, and then my wife is Mexican, so I completely relate to many of the themes. But I think it's also very universal, and like anybody can relate to that. There's a question from one of our Academy members, Shailene. She asks, can you give us some tips and tricks to creating likable characters? I remember that Amber was not, like, her personality grew into the final version, but there was some struggle at the beginning.
Yes. I feel like likable characters, it's a very sensitive word for me, I have to say, on what that means. Like, wanting to connect to a character. Look, the Ember is a very fiery character. She's got anger, she's got a temper, she explodes. And there were notes that were like, oh, I don't understand why, it's hard to connect to her. At first I took that as like, oh, do I remove this part of her? You quickly find out like, no, it's really understanding the layers of this character, and then understanding it's not just layering fun things, it's trying to layer things that support or have evolved from the missing piece of her. I didn't know what that missing piece was for early on. We tried different things, but in a romance movie, understanding what that character needs. Like for Ember, I needed to understand what she was missing, and once I started playing around with that, and then the temper didn't just become this thing that just happened because she's fiery. All of a sudden, it was the red herring that was covering up that hole. The temper started to become useful because it's like, oh, the temper just isn't something that's a part of her. It's literally her interior knocking on the door to the exterior to tell her, look, you're missing something. This shop is not for you. But she believes that the shop is. And all of a sudden, that one piece became a layer to her that started really helping the story. That we added these other layers in terms of like how dutiful she is to her father. I don't say love immediately. I say devoted, how devoted she is. I used to think it was duty, where it was just about, I have to do this for my father, but it's devotion. It is, I do this out of love, which is such a different thing, but you're just layering. And so I would say the tip would be understanding what that main character is for in the film, how you're using this character, and then layering character traits to support what that is. It may not be a hole in the character that you're building. It may be something else, but that was one way. And then, having a good story team was really useful. They just started really exploring different layers,
Well, Peter, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And I keep watching the movie and I can't wait to watch it again now that it's out with my kids. And I'm sure they're gonna love it as well. But for me, it was like a very personal experience, like watching it multiple times. Thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Pietro. That was really special. I really appreciate it all, getting a chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Let us know about your favorite part of the interview in the comments below. We've put together a video lesson that teaches you the basics of a romantic comedy and learn from Peter's Sohn how you can subvert the genre. So you can watch it here, and I'll see you next time.